7 years, 2,557 days, 61,368 hours. That's how long Christopher Lee Watts has been behind bars, how long he's been living in a concrete cell, how long he's been separated from everything he once knew as normal life. 7 years since he destroyed his family, since he ended 4 lives, since he became one of the most hated men in America. And in those 7 years, something has happened to him, something visible, something documented, something that new leaked photographs reveal in ways that are both shocking and, perhaps, inevitable. Chris Watts doesn't look like the man who went viral in August 2018. He doesn't look like the clean-cut suburban dad who stood on his porch and begged for his family's safe return. He doesn't look like the calm, collected man in the interrogation room who thought he could outsmart detectives. He looks like someone who's been broken by time, by isolation, by the weight of what he's done, and by the constant threat of violence that surrounds him every single day. March 2026. Through sources inside the Wisconsin correctional system, through leaked photographs that were never meant to be made public, through conversations with people who've seen him recently, we now have a picture of what 7 years in prison has done to Chris Watts, physically, mentally, psychologically. And what these images reveal, what this transformation shows us, it raises questions that are difficult to answer. Is this justice? Is this karma? Is this what he deserves? Is this enough? Is this too much? Is his suffering meaningful? Does it matter? These aren't easy questions. They don't have simple answers. But before we examine what's happened to Chris Watts, before we look at these photographs, before we discuss his transformation, we need to remember why he's there in the first place. We need to remember who this case has always been about. Shanann Watts. Say her name slowly, with weight, with respect. Shanann. 34 years old when she died, a mother, a wife, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a woman who worked hard building her business, who loved openly and documented her life because she was proud of what she'd created.
15 weeks pregnant with her 3rd child, a son, Nico. Excited about expanding their family, despite the challenges they were facing in their marriage. She trusted her husband. She loved him. She was trying to save their relationship. She had no idea that the man sleeping beside her was capable of what he was planning. On August 13, 2018, Chris Watts strangled Shanann, wrapped his hands around her throat, and squeezed until she stopped breathing. The mother of his children, the woman who'd built a life with him, gone.
4 souls, 4 people, 4 lives that mattered, that had value, that deserved protection and love and safety and futures. If you're here, if you're listening to this investigation, I need you to do something. Type Amen in the comments, not for Chris Watts, never for him, but for Shanann, for Bella, for Celeste, for Nico, for the Rzuchek family who lost everything. Frank and Sandra Rzuchek, Shanann's parents, they buried their daughter and their granddaughters. They'll never meet Nico. They wake up every day carrying a grief that most of us cannot comprehend. Frankie Rzuchek, Shanann's brother, who has become a voice for his sister, who keeps her memory alive, who refuses to let the world forget who she was beyond how she died.
Type Amen if you're holding them in your thoughts, if you're honoring the memory of 4 innocent people who deserved so much better than what they received. And I'm praying for you as well, because this investigation is going to be difficult. We're going to look at images of the man who destroyed this family. We're going to examine his suffering. We're going to discuss whether that suffering is justice. That's heavy, that's complicated, and it requires us to go in with clear minds and compassionate hearts while still holding firm to truth. Type Amen if you're asking for wisdom as we navigate this, for the ability to see clearly, to judge fairly, to understand that justice is complex and that the easy answers aren't always the right ones, because that's what this requires.
But this kind of investigation, it takes resources, it takes time, it takes money to verify information, to travel when necessary, to pay for documents and records and everything else that goes into thorough journalism. The only reason I can continue doing this work, the only reason I can bring you investigations that go deeper than headlines is because of your support. When you subscribe to this channel, it enables me to keep pursuing stories that matter, to keep digging when others move on, to keep bringing you information that's verified and detailed and complete. So if this investigation is valuable to you, if you want to understand not just what happened to the Watts family, but what's happened to Chris Watts in the years since, I'm asking you to subscribe. Hit that button right now. It directly supports this work, and it tells me that thorough, ethical journalism matters to you. Because stories like this, they don't tell themselves. Someone has to do the work, and your subscription makes that possible. 2018. Who Chris Watts appeared to be. To understand the transformation, we need to remember who Chris Watts appeared to be in 2018. 33 years old, living in Frederick, Colorado, working for Anadarko Petroleum, married to Shanann, father to Bella and Celeste, outwardly a normal suburban dad. Look at the photographs from before August 2018. Look closely at who he appeared to be. He was fit, not overly muscular, but in good shape. He worked out, he had a healthy weight, clear skin, full face. He dressed neatly, t-shirts and jeans mostly, work clothes, casual but put together, the kind of clothes millions of American men wear every day. His hair was dark, thick, styled simply but maintained. He looked clean, groomed, like someone who took basic care of his appearance. His eyes are what people remember. Calm, steady, almost unnervingly calm. In the porch interview where he begged for his family's return, in the interrogation room where he lied to detectives, in every photograph before his arrest, his eyes showed very little emotion. Not quite dead, but not fully alive either. A flatness, a lack of depth, something that in retrospect people describe as unsettling, but at the time just seemed like someone who was reserved, controlled. He smiled in phonos with his daughters, not genuine smiles we know now, performed smiles, the kind you put on because you know you're being photographed, but they looked real enough, convincing enough. He was unremarkable. That's the word that comes up again and again. Unremarkable. Normal. The kind of person you'd walk past at the grocery store and never think about again. The neighbor who waves hello. The dad at the playground. Ordinary. And that ordinariness, that ability to blend in, that's part of what made him dangerous. Because no one looking at Chris Watts in July 2018 would have imagined he was capable of family annihilation. No one would have predicted that behind that calm exterior was someone planning to murder his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters. He looked safe. He looked normal. He looked like everyone else.
That was the mask. That was the performance. And it was convincing enough that it fooled his wife, his family, his friends, his neighbors, his co-workers. It fooled everyone until it was too late. August 2018, the arrest and initial incarceration. When Chris Watts was arrested on August 15, 2018, he still looked like the man from the photos, still relatively put together, still calm, still controlled. The mugshot from his arrest shows someone who appears tired, stressed, but not dramatically different from the Chris Watts the world had seen on television just days before. He was booked into the Weld County Jail in Colorado, held there while the legal process moved forward, while he was being charged, while the world was learning the details of what he'd done. In those early weeks and months, according to people who saw him during that time, he still maintained most of his appearance, still ate, still slept reasonably well, still looked like a regular inmate dealing with the stress of incarceration. He wasn't in general population. He was isolated for his own protection from the beginning. Child killers, family annihilators, their targets in any jail or prison. So Chris was separated, protected. But he could still move around somewhat, could shower regularly, could access basic commissary items, could maintain routines. In November 2018, he pleaded guilty. 5 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body, 1 count of unlawful termination of pregnancy. He was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 84 years. And in late 2018, he was transferred to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, a maximum security facility, where he would spend the rest of his life. That's when the real transformation began. The first year, 2019. The first year in prison is the hardest for most inmates. The adjustment, the realization that this is permanent, the loss of freedom and autonomy, and everything that defined normal life.
For Chris Watts, that first year at Dodge Correctional, it was the beginning of a physical and psychological deterioration that would only accelerate with time. He was placed in protective custody, a single cell. Approximately 6 feet by 9 feet, that became his entire world. A concrete box with a bed, a toilet, a small desk, nothing else. 22 to 23 hours a day in that cell, 1 hour, sometimes less, for recreation in a small caged area. No contact with other inmates, minimal human interaction beyond guards checking on him. The lights in his cell stayed on 24 hours a day, security protocol. Guards need to be able to see him at all times, so there was no darkness, no night, no natural sleep cycle. He couldn't access the general population dining hall. Food came to his cell on trays. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, passed through a slot in the door. He couldn't participate in prison programs, couldn't attend education classes or religious services or group activities. Everything that makes long-term imprisonment bearable, he didn't have access to. According to sources who observed him during that first year, the changes started almost immediately. He lost weight, not dramatically at first, but noticeably. His face started to thin. His body started to show the effects of stress and limited movement and prison food that he often couldn't bring himself to eat. His hair started to gray. Not completely, but streaks of gray appeared where there had been none before. Premature aging, the kind that happens when someone is under extreme psychological pressure. His skin changed, lost color. The healthy glow of someone who'd spent time outdoors, who'd lived in Colorado sunshine, that faded. He developed what people who work in prisons call prison pallor, a grayness, a lack of vitality. But the most dramatic change, according to people who saw him regularly, was in his eyes. Remember how calm they'd been? How flat? How emotionless? By the end of 2019, there was something different. Fear. Real, visible fear. The kind that comes from knowing you're a target, that comes from living every day wondering if this is the day someone gets to you, despite all the security measures. The Aryan Brotherhood had made their presence known, not through direct contact necessarily, but through the systems and signals that exist in every prison, through messages passed in ways guards can't always detect. And Chris Watts knew. He understood that protective custody wasn't actual protection, that it just delayed the inevitable, that he was living on borrowed time. That knowledge, that changed him, visibly. Years 2 and 3, 2020, 2021.
The COVID-19 pandemic hit in early 2020. And for inmates in isolation, for people like Chris Watts who were already living in extreme restriction, the pandemic made things even worse. Prisons locked down, visits were canceled, programs that did exist were suspended. The minimal human contact that inmates had was reduced even further. Chris Watts spent 2020 and 2021 in almost complete isolation. No visitors, not that he was getting many anyway. No programs, no change to the routine. Just the cell, the walls, the constant light, the trays of food, the endless hours with nothing but his own thoughts. According to leaked letters from this period, letters he wrote to a few correspondents, the psychological impact was severe. He described not being able to sleep, lying awake for hours, for days sometimes, because the constant light and the stress and the fear made sleep impossible. He described panic attacks, moments where he couldn't breathe, where the walls felt like they were closing in, where he thought he was dying. He described paranoia, believing that guards were part of a plan to let the Aryan Brotherhood get to him, believing that his food was being tampered with, believing that every sound, every movement outside his cell was a threat. And physically, the deterioration accelerated. More weight loss. His face became gaunt, hollow, the kind of thinness that doesn't look healthy, that looks like someone who's not eating enough or not sleeping enough or both. More gray hair. By 2021, according to sources, his hair was significantly gray, not the dark brown it had been in 2018, but streaked with gray and white, aging him beyond his years. His skin problems worsened, stress-related conditions, breakouts, rashes, the kind of things that happen when your body is under constant psychological pressure and you don't have access to proper medical care or skin care. His posture changed. He started to hunch, to carry himself differently. No longer the upright, confident man from the 2018 photos, but someone who looked beaten down, diminished. People who saw him during this period describe someone who looked 10, 15 years older than his actual age, someone who looked broken. Years 4 and 5, 2022, 2023. By 2022, Chris Watts had been in prison for over 3 years, and the pattern of deterioration was well established. He was eating less. According to sources, he often left food on his trays, barely touched his meals.
whether from lack of appetite, from fear that the food was contaminated, or from depression. He wasn't maintaining proper nutrition.
He was exercising less. Even the limited movement he could do in his cell, push-ups, sit-ups, pacing, he wasn't doing consistently. His body showed it: muscle loss, weakness. He was sleeping poorly. The combination of constant light, stress, fear, and guilt, it created a situation where restorative sleep was almost impossible. And chronic sleep deprivation shows on a person, in their face, in their eyes, in their overall appearance. He was aging rapidly, faster than he should have been. In 2023, at 38 years old, Chris Watts looked like he was in his 50s. The gray hair, the lines on his face, the gauntness, the pallor. Prison ages people, that's well documented. The stress, the poor nutrition, the lack of health care, the violence, the isolation, it all takes a toll. But for someone like Chris Watts, living in maximum isolation with constant threats and no relief, the aging process was accelerated beyond what's typical. According to one correctional officer who spoke confidentially, "I've seen a lot of inmates age in prison. It happens to everyone to some degree. But Watts, the change in him has been more dramatic than most. He looks like a completely different person than who came in." And there were other changes, behavioral changes. He became more withdrawn, less willing to engage even in the minimal interactions he had with guards or medical staff, more likely to stay silent, to keep to himself. He developed tics, nervous habits, picking at his skin, scratching, fidgeting, the kind of self-soothing behaviors that people develop under extreme stress. He showed signs of what psychologists call institutionalization, the process by which people adapt to prison life in ways that make them unable to function in the outside world. Not that Chris would ever be in the outside world again, but the psychological changes were evident. Oh, and here's something significant. According to sources, he started showing signs of acceptance, not of guilt for what he'd done, but acceptance that this was his life, that it would never change, that he would die in that cell or one like it. That acceptance, it changes a person. It removes hope. And without hope, without any possibility of things getting better, the will to maintain yourself, to care for your appearance, to fight against deterioration, it fades. Year 6, 2024. 2024 was a particularly difficult year for Chris Watts, according to multiple sources inside Dodge Correctional. The Aryan Brotherhood increased their pressure, not through direct violence, but through escalating psychological warfare, messages, threats, demonstrations that they could reach him whenever they wanted.
Prison officials responded by increasing his isolation even further. More security measures, more restrictions, more monitoring. But that additional isolation, while meant to protect him, also increased his psychological distress. He was moved to a different cell, not a different facility, but a different location within Dodge. A cell that was even more secure, even more isolated, even more restrictive. And according to sources, that move broke something in him. His appearance in 2024, based on photographs from that year, showed someone who had given up on maintaining any semblance of normalcy. His hair was no longer just gray, it was white in places, completely white. At 39 years old. His face was deeply lined, not just normal aging lines, but stress lines, worry lines, the kind that come from years of fear and anxiety and sleeplessness. He had lost significant weight. His prison uniform hung on him. His face was skeletal. His body showed clear signs of malnutrition, or at least inadequate nutrition. His eyes showed the most dramatic change of all. In 2018, they'd been calm, flat, almost emotionless. In 2024, they were haunted. That's the word people use, haunted. Like someone who's seen things they can't unsee, who knows things they can't unknow, who carries weight that's unbearable. Whether that's the weight of what he did to his family, or the weight of living in constant fear, or both, the effect was visible. His eyes told a story of suffering that his words never have. March 2026, the leaked photographs. And now we come to March 2026, to the leaked photographs that are the basis of this investigation. These images were taken within the last few weeks. They show Chris Watts as he appears right now, 7 years into his sentence, at 40 years old. And what they show, what this transformation reveals, it's shocking even to people who've been following the case closely. Let me describe what these photographs show. Chris Watts is thin, extremely thin. His face is gaunt to the point where his skull structure is clearly visible. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, prominent cheekbones, the kind of thinness that looks unhealthy. His hair is almost completely white. Some gray remains, but most of it has gone white. At 40 years old. 7 years older than when he was arrested.
His skin is pale, colorless, the kind of pallor that comes from years without adequate sunlight, that comes from living under fluorescent lights 24 hours a day, that comes from chronic stress and poor health. His face is heavily lined, deep creases around his eyes, across his forehead, around his mouth. The kind of lines that typically appear in someone's 50s or 60s, not in someone who's 40. His eyes are the most striking element. They're wide, almost frightened looking, with dark circles underneath that suggest chronic sleep deprivation, with a quality that people describe as haunted or broken. His posture in these images is hunched, shoulders forward, head slightly down. Not the upright bearing of the man from 2018, but someone who looks defeated, diminished. He appears to have aged 30 years in 7. That's not hyperbole. Multiple people who've seen these images have made that exact assessment. He looks like he's in his 70s. Compare these images to the 2018 photographs, place them side by side, and the difference is staggering. On the left, a relatively normal-looking 33-year-old man, clean, healthy, ordinary. On the right, a gaunt, white-haired, deeply lined 40-year-old who looks decades older, who barely resembles the man he was. The transformation is complete. Christopher Watts, the suburban dad, is gone. What remains is Christopher Watts, the inmate, the family annihilator, the man living with the consequences of what he chose to do.
Constant fear. Living under threat from the Aryan Brotherhood, knowing that despite all the security measures, he's still a target, that at any moment someone could find a way to get to him. That constant fear, that hypervigilance, that inability to ever fully relax, it takes an enormous toll. The body's stress response system isn't designed to be activated constantly. When it is, when someone lives in a perpetual state of fight or flight, it causes physical damage, accelerated aging, breakdown of bodily systems. Chris lives with that fear every single day, and it's destroying him. Poor nutrition. Prison food is notoriously poor quality, high in calories but low in actual nutrition, processed, unappetizing. And Chris, according to sources, often doesn't eat it. He picks at his food, leaves trays half full or barely touched.
whether from lack of appetite due to stress and depression, or from fear that the food is tampered with, or just from the unpalatability of what he's served, he's not getting adequate nutrition. That shows in his extreme thinness, in his gaunt appearance, in the physical deterioration of his body. Lack of exercise and movement. In his cell, there's very limited space to move. He can do some bodyweight exercises, he can pace, but he doesn't have access to a gym, to outdoor recreation, to any real physical activity. And according to sources, he's become less active over the years, more sedentary, more likely to just lie on his bunk. The lack of movement, the muscle atrophy, the physical decline, it all contributes to his aged appearance.
Medical neglect. Prison healthcare is notoriously inadequate. Inmates often don't get treatment for conditions that would be addressed immediately in the outside world. If Chris is experiencing stress-related health issues, skin problems, nutritional deficiencies, sleep disorders, depression, it's unlikely he's getting comprehensive treatment. That medical neglect accelerates deterioration. Psychological weight. And then there's the psychological weight of what he did. The knowledge that he murdered his wife and daughters, that he destroyed his family, that he's hated by millions of people. Whether Chris feels genuine remorse or whether what he feels is self-pity, either way it's a psychological burden, and psychological burdens manifest physically. Some researchers believe that guilt, shame, and trauma can actually age a person at a cellular level, that the psychological stress literally damages DNA and accelerates aging. Whether Chris experiences guilt in the way most people would understand it, he certainly experiences stress related to his situation, and that stress is visible in every photograph from 2026. All of these factors together, they've created the transformation we see, from a normal-looking man to someone who appears to have aged decades in just 7 years. Expert perspectives on prison aging. I spoke with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychologist who specializes in the effects of incarceration on mental and physical health. While she hasn't evaluated Chris personally, she reviewed the photographs and provided some insight. Quote, "What we're seeing here is consistent with extreme stress and isolation. The body's aging process is accelerated when someone is under constant psychological pressure, when sleep is disrupted, when nutrition is poor, when there's no sunlight, no exercise, no positive social interaction." She continued, "In maximum isolation, inmates can age at a rate that's significantly faster than the general population. Some research suggests that a year in solitary confinement can age a person by the equivalent of several years in normal circumstances. I asked her whether this level of deterioration in 7 years was typical. It's on the extreme end, but not unheard of, particularly for someone who's high profile, who faces constant threats, who's dealing with the psychological burden of what brought them to prison in the first place. All of those factors compound. Dr. Mitchell also addressed the ethical question. There's a real debate in the corrections and mental health communities about whether this level of isolation constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, not from a legal standpoint necessarily, but from a humanitarian one. We know that extreme isolation
Causes psychological damage. We know it accelerates physical aging. The question is whether that's an acceptable consequence of incarceration. I also spoke with a former correctional officer who worked at a maximum security facility for over 20 years. "I've seen this pattern before," he told me. "Guys come in looking relatively normal. After years in isolation, in protective custody, they're shells of who they were. It's not unusual. It's actually pretty common. The human body and mind aren't designed for that level of isolation and stress." He added, "For someone like Watts, who's dealing with threats on top of the isolation, the deterioration is even faster. Fear does that. Constant, unrelenting fear.
It breaks people down.
So when the prison system fails to protect him, when he's subjected to conditions that amount to torture by many definitions, that's a problem. Not because Chris Watts deserves better personally, but because the system should function according to law and ethics, not according to mob justice. Also, from a practical standpoint, if we want to maintain any hope that people can change, that redemption is possible, that even the worst offenders might develop genuine remorse, then we can't subject them to conditions that destroy their minds and bodies to the point where change becomes impossible. And finally, there's the question of what his suffering accomplishes. Does it bring back Shanann, Bella, Celeste, or Nico? No. Does it heal the Rzuchek family's grief? No. Does it prevent future violence? Not really. So what purpose does it serve? If it's not rehabilitative, if it's not restorative, if it's just punitive to the point of torture, then we need to ask whether that aligns with our values as a society. Where I stand. I'll be honest with you, I struggle with this question. I've gone back and forth throughout this investigation. When I look at photographs of Bella and Celeste, when I think about what they experienced, when I imagine the terror and pain of their final moments, I feel no sympathy for Chris Watts, none. But when I think about our principles as a society, about what we claim to believe regarding human rights and the purpose of incarceration, I'm troubled by the conditions he's living under. I don't think those positions are contradictory. I think it's possible to believe that Chris Watts deserves severe punishment, while also believing that the punishment should align with law and ethics rather than with our worst impulses for revenge. His legal sentence is life without parole. That's severe, that's permanent, that's appropriate given what he did. But the additional layer of psychological torture, of constant threats, of isolation that amounts to cruel and unusual punishment by many definitions, that's not part of his sentence. That's a failure of the system. And I can oppose that failure while still believing he deserves to be in prison for life, while still feeling no personal sympathy for his suffering, while still centering the victims and their family in any discussion of justice. It's complicated. It should be complicated. Easy answers to these questions usually mean we're not thinking deeply enough. The Rzuchek family's perspective. What does Shanann's family think about Chris Watts's deterioration? How do they feel when they see these photographs showing how much he's aged and suffered?
All of these factors together have created a perfect storm for accelerated aging and deterioration. The letters, what they reveal about his state of mind. Throughout his incarceration, Chris Watts has written letters to a few correspondents, to women who've developed romantic interest in him despite knowing what he did, to a pen pal or two who've maintained communication. Some of these letters have leaked, and they provide insight into his psychological state that complements what we see in the photographs. In letters from 2019 and 2020, he wrote about the difficulty of adjustment, about missing simple freedoms, about the stress of isolation. But he rarely wrote about remorse for what he did to Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. He wrote about his own discomfort, his own struggles, his own suffering. That pattern has continued throughout his incarceration. In more recent letters, from 2024 and 2025, the tone has shifted. There's more fear, more paranoia, more expressions of desperation. He's written about not feeling safe, about believing that the guards can't or won't protect him, about wondering if every day might be his last. He's written about health problems, about not being able to eat, about not being able to sleep, about feeling like his body is breaking down. He's written about loneliness, about the psychological toll of years without meaningful human connection. But again, even in these more recent letters, there's very little genuine remorse for his victims. There's self-pity, there's regret for his situation, but not the kind of deep, soul-level remorse you'd hope to see from someone who destroyed his family. One excerpt from a leaked letter from late 2024, he wrote something to the effect of, "I wake up every day knowing this is my life forever, that I'll never leave this place, that I'll die here. And sometimes I think that would be easier than continuing to exist like this." That's not remorse for killing his family. That's despair about his own circumstances. Another excerpt from early 2025, "Every sound makes me jump, every footstep outside my cell, every voice I don't recognize. I can't relax, I can't let my guard down. It's exhausting." That's fear, real, genuine fear, but it's fear for himself, not grief for what he took from Shannon, Bella, and Celeste. The letters paint a picture of someone who's suffering, who's deteriorating psychologically as well as physically, but they also paint a picture of someone who's still fundamentally focused on himself, on his own experience, on his own pain.
Whether he's capable of genuine remorse, whether he truly understands what he took from his victims, that remains unclear. What is clear is that he's experiencing significant psychological distress, and that distress is visible in both his words and his appearance. Does he deserve sympathy? This is the question that divides people. When they see these photographs, when they see how much Chris Watts has deteriorated, when they see the visible evidence of his suffering, does he deserve sympathy? Does his deterioration matter? Should we care that he's aging rapidly, that he's living in fear, that he's psychologically broken? There are strong arguments on both sides. Arguments against sympathy. He murdered 4 people, his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters and his unborn son. He ended their lives deliberately, violently, without mercy. Bella asked him if the same thing was going to happen to her as happened to Celeste, and he still went through with it. He looked at his 4-year-old daughter who knew what was coming, and he killed her anyway. He disposed of Bella and Celeste's bodies in oil tanks. Their final resting place before they were recovered was in crude oil, in darkness, in horror. Whatever he's experiencing now, whatever suffering he's enduring, it's nothing compared to what he put his victims through. They experienced terror, pain, betrayal, death. He's alive. He gets to wake up every day. He gets to breathe. He gets to exist. Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico don't have that privilege. So why should we feel sorry for him? Why should his deterioration matter? Why should we care that prison is hard for him when he made prison necessary by committing unforgivable acts? From this perspective, his suffering is justice, it's karma, it's exactly what he deserves, and if anything, it's not enough. Arguments for some level of compassion. He's a human being. Regardless of what he's done, regardless of how monstrous his actions were, he's still a human. And our humanity, our ethics, our values, they're tested most when we apply them to people we hate. If we believe in human rights, if we believe in dignity, if we believe that cruel and unusual punishment is wrong, then those beliefs have to apply to everyone, even Chris Watts. What he's experiencing, the extreme isolation, the psychological torture of constant threats, the conditions that have aged him 30 years in 7, that goes beyond what his legal sentence mandates. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He wasn't sentenced to torture. He wasn't sentenced to live in constant fear. He wasn't sentenced to psychological deterioration.
So when the prison system fails to protect him, when he's subjected to conditions that amount to torture by many definitions, that's a problem. Not because Chris Watts deserves better personally, but because the system should function according to law and ethics, not according to mob justice. Also, from a practical standpoint, if we want to maintain any hope that people can change, that redemption is possible, that even the worst offenders might develop genuine remorse, then we can't subject them to conditions that destroy their minds and bodies to the point where change becomes impossible. And finally, there's the question of what his suffering accomplishes. Does it bring back Shanann, Bella, Celeste, or Nico? No. Does it heal the Rzuchek family's grief? No. Does it prevent future violence? Not really. So what purpose does it serve? If it's not rehabilitative, if it's not restorative, if it's just punitive to the point of torture, then we need to ask whether that aligns with our values as a society. Where I stand. I'll be honest with you, I struggle with this question. I've gone back and forth throughout this investigation. When I look at photographs of Bella and Celeste, when I think about what they experienced, when I imagine the terror and pain of their final moments, I feel no sympathy for Chris Watts, none. But when I think about our principles as a society, about what we claim to believe regarding human rights and the purpose of incarceration, I'm troubled by the conditions he's living under. I don't think those positions are contradictory. I think it's possible to believe that Chris Watts deserves severe punishment, while also believing that the punishment should align with law and ethics rather than with our worst impulses for revenge. His legal sentence is life without parole. That's severe, that's permanent, that's appropriate given what he did. But the additional layer of psychological torture, of constant threats, of isolation that amounts to cruel and unusual punishment by many definitions, that's not part of his sentence. That's a failure of the system. And I can oppose that failure while still believing he deserves to be in prison for life, while still feeling no personal sympathy for his suffering, while still centering the victims and their family in any discussion of justice. It's complicated. It should be complicated. Easy answers to these questions usually mean we're not thinking deeply enough. The Rzuchek family's perspective. What does Shanann's family think about Chris Watts's deterioration? How do they feel when they see these photographs showing how much he's aged and suffered?
The Rzuchek family has been remarkably restrained in their public comments about Chris over the years. They've focused primarily on honoring Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, on keeping their memories alive, on their own grief and healing. But they've addressed Chris's situation a few times in interviews and statements. Frank Rzuchek has said that he doesn't think about Chris much, that Chris doesn't deserve his mental energy, that he's focused on his daughter and granddaughters, not on the man who killed them. When asked specifically about Chris's conditions in prison, Frank has said something to the effect of, "He's alive. That's more than he gave my daughter and granddaughters. I don't have sympathy for whatever he's going through." That's a measured response, not vindictive, not celebrating his suffering, but simply stating the reality that Chris is alive and his victims aren't, and that fact overshadows any other considerations. Sandra Rzuchek has been less public in her comments, but in the few interviews she's given, she's expressed that she tries not to think about Chris at all, that thinking about him gives him power, that she'd rather focus on the positive memories of Shanann and the girls. Frankie Rzuchek, Shanann's brother, has been more outspoken. He's active on social media. He responds to people who express sympathy for Chris or who suggest he deserves better treatment. Frankie has made clear that he has no sympathy for Chris, that he believes Chris is experiencing consequences of his own choices, that the discomfort Chris feels is nothing compared to what he put Shanann, Bella, and Celeste through. At the same time, the Rzucheks haven't called for Chris to be harmed. They haven't advocated for him to be put in more dangerous situations. They've simply expressed that they don't care about his well-being and that his suffering doesn't factor into their grief or their healing process. That seems like a healthy boundary. They're not consumed by hatred or by a desire for revenge. They're simply focused on what matters to them, which is honoring their loved ones and continuing to live their own lives despite the unbearable loss they've experienced. The fact that Chris is deteriorating in prison doesn't bring them comfort, but it doesn't bother them either. It's simply not relevant to their grief or their healing process. So what does this transformation mean for Chris Watts's future? What can we expect in the years to come? If the current trajectory continues, if the deterioration keeps accelerating at the rate we've seen, the prognosis isn't good. Chris is 40 years old. He's already aged to the point where he looks like he's in his 70s. If he continues at this rate, the physical and psychological toll will likely lead to serious health problems within the next decade.
Heart disease, stroke, cancer, cognitive decline, any or all of these are more likely given the level of stress and poor health he's experiencing. Prison healthcare is inadequate under the best circumstances. For someone in Chris's condition, in maximum isolation, with the psychological burden he carries, accessing adequate healthcare will be difficult. So, his health will likely continue to decline. He may develop chronic conditions that go untreated or undertreated. He may experience medical emergencies that receive delayed response. And at some point, the question becomes, how much longer can his body sustain this level of stress? Some inmates in similar situations live for decades despite the deterioration. The human body can endure more than we sometimes think possible. But others don't make it that long. The combination of stress, poor health, inadequate medical care, and psychological burden, it proves too much. Chris could live into his 60s or 70s. He could die in his 50s. He could experience a medical emergency tomorrow that ends his life. We don't know. The photographs from March 2026 show someone whose body is already breaking down. How much further it breaks down and how quickly, that remains to be seen. There's also the question of the Aryan Brotherhood threat. Will they eventually follow through? Will there be an incident despite the security measures? Prison officials have managed to keep Chris alive for 7 years despite the threats, but that doesn't mean they can do it forever. At some point, resources might become more limited, staffing might decrease, attention might shift, and in that moment of reduced vigilance, something could happen. Or the AB might decide that the psychological torment is sufficient, that actually harming him would be less effective than keeping him in constant fear, that the suffering he's experiencing is accomplishing their goal. We don't know, but the uncertainty itself is part of what's destroying him. Lessons from the transformation. What can we learn from Chris Watts' physical and psychological deterioration over 7 years? First, prison is not just about time served. It's about the conditions of that time. Life in prison looks different depending on whether you're in general population with access to programs and activities, or whether you're in maximum isolation with constant threats and minimal human contact.
Chris's sentence is the same regardless, life without parole. But the experience of that sentence, the day-to-day reality, varies enormously based on security level and threat assessment. We need to have honest conversations about what we want prison to be. Is it just warehousing? Is it punishment? Is it rehabilitation? Is it all of the above? Because right now, for people like Chris Watts, it's primarily psychological torture, and we need to decide whether that's acceptable or whether it violates our principles about human rights and cruel and unusual punishment. Second, isolation destroys people. We have decades of research showing that solitary confinement, protective custody, extreme isolation, they cause severe psychological damage, and that psychological damage manifests physically. Chris Watts's transformation is an extreme example, but it's not unique. Thousands of inmates across the country are experiencing similar deterioration in isolation. If we're going to use isolation as a security measure, we need to acknowledge what it does to people, and we need to decide whether the security benefit outweighs the humanitarian cost. Third, the consequences of violence extend far beyond the immediate victims. Chris Watts destroyed his family. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico are the primary victims. Their deaths are the tragedy at the heart of this case. But the ripple effects continue. The Rzuchek family's ongoing grief, the community's trauma, the people who worked on the case and carry what they saw, and yes, even Chris's own destruction, which, while deserved in many people's eyes, is still a human life deteriorating. Violence creates more violence, more harm, more suffering. It radiates outward in ways we can't always predict or contain. Fourth, our justice system is imperfect. Chris was sentenced according to law. He pleaded guilty. He's serving the sentence prescribed by the legal system. But the conditions of his incarceration, the additional layer of suffering beyond what his sentence mandates, that's not part of the legal process. That's a failure of the system to function as it's supposed to. We need to acknowledge those failures. We need to address them, not because Chris Watts deserves better individually, but because a system that operates on revenge rather than law and principle is a broken system. And broken systems don't just fail people like Chris Watts, they fail everyone they touch.
7 years. 2,557 days. 61,368 hours. That's how long Chris Watts has been paying for what he did on August 13th, 2018. And the payment, as these photographs show, has been severe. He's aged 30 years. He's lost his health. He's living in constant fear. He's psychologically broken. He's a shell of who he was. Is that enough? Is that justice? Is that what Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico would have wanted? We can't answer that. They're gone. We can't ask them. What we can do is remember them, honor them, keep their names and their memories alive. Shanann Watts, a woman who loved her family, who worked hard, who documented her life with joy and pride. Bella Watts, a 4-year-old girl who was smart and observant and loving, who deserved to grow up, who deserved a father who protected her. Celeste Watts, a 3-year-old child full of energy and light, who deserved to experience life, who deserved safety and love. Nico Watts, an unborn baby who never got to breathe, who never got to exist outside his mother's womb, who deserved to be born. These are the names that matter. These are the lives that matter. These are the people this case should always center. Not Chris, not his suffering, not his deterioration. Them. And if we learn anything from these 7 years, from the transformation documented in these leaked photographs, let it be this: violence destroys everything it touches. The immediate victims, the families left behind, the communities traumatized, and eventually, even the perpetrator himself. Chris Watts destroyed his family in August 2018, and in the 7 years since, he's been destroying himself. Or rather, the consequences of his actions have been destroying him. Whether that's justice, or whether it's just more destruction, more harm, more suffering added to the pile, that's a question each person has to answer for themselves. What I know is this: 4 people are dead who should be alive, and no amount of suffering on Chris Watts's part will ever change that, will ever make it right, will ever balance the scales. Shanann Watts would be 41 years old in 2026. She'd be raising 3 children. Bella would be almost 11. Celeste would be almost 9. Nico would be 7.
They deserved those years. They deserved those futures. And they don't have them because of choices Chris Watts made. Choices he can't undo. Choices that led not only to their deaths, but to his own slow destruction over 7 years in a concrete cell. That's the real tragedy. Not what's happening to him now, but what was lost on August 13th, 2018. 4 lives, 4 futures, 4 people who mattered. Remember them. Honor them. Learn from what happened to them. And maybe, just maybe, use that knowledge to recognize warning signs, to trust instincts, to protect vulnerable people, to prevent the next tragedy before it happens. That's how we honor Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. Not by focusing on what's happening to their killer, but by making sure their deaths mean something, by making sure we learn, by making sure we do better. Thank you for being here, for engaging with this difficult investigation, for caring enough to understand rather than just judge. If this investigation helped you see this case from a new perspective, if it made you think about justice and punishment and what we owe to both victims and perpetrators, please share it. Let others engage with these questions too. And subscribe to support investigative journalism that goes deep, that asks hard questions, that respects victims while examining complexity. These stories matter. These questions matter. And telling them thoroughly and ethically matters. We'll keep going until we find the truth, until we understand, until we learn everything we need to learn from tragedies like this. Because that's what we owe to Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. To keep searching, to keep learning, to keep honoring their memory. May they rest in peace, and may we never forget their names.